For years, Meghan's life had been a symphony of noise, headlines, flashing lights, whispers behind gilded doors. But now, silence had become her companion. In the early mornings of California, she would sit in the garden, barefoot on the dew-kissed grass, a cup of tea warming her hands. The air smelled of rosemary and orange blossoms. She had learned that peace wasn't the absence of sound but the presence of understanding. For the first time, she could hear her own thoughts clearly. Not the ones shaped by duty or fear, but the quiet voices he had once buried beneath the weight of expectation. Sometimes she thought about London, the cold fog, the stiff smiles, the endless protocol. But instead of anger, she felt gratitude. Every tear, every misunderstanding had softened her edges. Pain, she realized, had not broken her, it had polished her into clarity. Maybe the world doesn't need me to prove anything, she whispered once. Maybe it just needs me to be. Over time, Meghan began to understand that grace was not about perfection. It was about how one rose after being misunderstood. When she spoke now, her tone was softer, but her message carried deeper weight. Forgiveness, she said in one interview, isn't approval. It's freedom. Many were surprised. Forgiveness for what? For whom? But Meghan wasn't forgiving for others. She was freeing herself from bitterness. She no longer needed Toan, the public's affection, or the palace's validation. Her peace was her rebellion. She spent her days writing, gardening, and working quietly with foundations that helped women rebuild after trauma. She didn't announce her efforts, she lived them. When critics resurfaced, she met them with silence, not as weakness, but as wisdom. Grace, she once wrote in her journal, isn't about shining brighter than others. It's about carrying your light where it's darkest and letting it warm without burning. It was the kind of lesson only those who have walked through pain could teach. Meghan found joy in the smallest of things, the smell of fresh bread, the laughter of her children, the rustle of leaves during late afternoon walks. Fame had once promised her everything, yet it was simplicity that finally gave her everything she needed. I used to think purpose was something grand, she told a friend, but now I see it in my son's drawings. When she and Harry cooked dinner together, the clatter of pans felt like music, imperfect, honest, human. She no longer needed palaces, she had presence. There was beauty in being ordinary, she realized, in folding laundry, in bedtime stories, in living without cameras. Every day, she practiced gratitude for the life she once feared losing. The storms had taught her to love quiet days. The scrutiny had taught her to cherish privacy. And the heartbreak had taught her that wholeness isn't the absence of scars, but the courage to wear them like jewels. When Meghan returned to public speaking, her voice carried a new tone, slower, grounded, sincere. Gone were the polished scripts of royal duty. Now her words came from truth, not tradition. "We must speak," she told a women's conference, "even when the world tells us to be quiet, especially then." The audience, mostly older women, listened with tears in their eyes. Many saw themselves in her. Women who had once been told to stay small, to smile instead of speak. Meghan's message wasn't rebellion, it was release. Her voice no longer trembled under the weight of approval. She spoke for those who had been silenced, not to be heard, but to remind them they were never alone. "It's not about changing the world," she said, "it's about not letting the world change your heart." Her words lingered long after the applause faded, not as noise, but as something gentler, like a prayer whispered in the language of resilience. Through everything, Harry remained her constant, steady, patient, unwavering. Their love had been tested by distance, duty, and doubt, yet it had survived, not because it was perfect, but because it was rooted in friendship. They laughed often, argued sometimes, and forgave always. Harry admired her strength. Meghan cherished his empathy. Together, they created a home where their children could grow in truth, not titles. Some evenings, they would sit under the stars, glasses of wine in hand, and talk about the life they had left behind, not with regret, but with understanding. "We didn't lose anything," Meghan once said softly. "We found what matters." Harry nodded, his hand resting over hers. "And we did it together." Theirs was no longer the fairy tale that began in Windsor Castle. It was something quieter, deeper, a love story rewritten not in gold, but in grace. As Archie grew older and Lilibet began to walk, Meghan found herself teaching lessons that no textbook could contain. She spoke to them softly, never preaching, only guiding. Kindness, she told Archie one afternoon as they watched a butterfly land on a flower, isn't about being nice. It's about being brave enough to care. The world outside might still call her names, question her choices, twist her intentions. But within her garden, there was no noise, only the gentle rhythm of motherhood. She taught her children not about crowns or privilege, but about empathy. Your words can heal, she whispered, so choose them like medicine. Sometimes when she tucked them into bed, she'd hum songs her mother once sang to her, old tunes about love and hope, carried now into a new generation. She wanted her children to know their roots, not as labels, but as stories. You come from women who stood tall in storms, she said one night, brushing Lilibet's curls, and that strength is your birthright. To Meghan, that was her greatest legacy, not fame, but raising souls unafraid of compassion. Beyond the cameras and headlines, Meghan's true work often went unseen. She visited women's shelters, funded education programs, and wrote private letters to survivors of hardship. There were no photographers, no press releases, only moments of connection that reminded her why she had left the palace in the first place. If kindness needs to be witnessed to count, she once told a friend, then it's not kindness, it's performance. The women she met didn't see her as royalty. They saw her as someone who understood pain and refused to be hardened by it. She listened more than she spoke, offering presence instead of pity. Her empathy came not from theory, but from experience, from knowing what it felt like to be misjudged, to be silenced, to rebuild quietly. One woman, after hugging her tightly, whispered, "You make us feel seen." Meghan smiled through tears. That's all I ever wanted. The world still debated her motives, but in those small, sacred exchanges, she found her truth again. There came a point when Meghan stopped looking back and started simply living. Her 40s were not an escape from youth but an arrival at selfhood. When you're younger, she once said in a quiet podcast interview, you think life is about proving. But peace comes when you realize you don't owe anyone an explanation. Her days were now slow and deliberate, mornings of yoga, afternoons filled with writing, evenings by candlelight. Fame had once defined her pace, now serenity defined her purpose. Aging, she realized, was not loss, it was liberation. The mirror no longer frightened her. It reflected someone who had survived and softened, not hardened. She no longer chased perfection but presence. Her face, once scrutinized, now carried the grace of a woman who had lived fully, who had wept, loved, and learned. For women watching her, especially those entering their own seasons of reflection, Meghan became a quiet reminder. It's never too late to begin again. If the palace had once defined her, now her peace did. Meghan no longer belonged to the story written about her. She had written her own. She had walked through scandal without losing compassion, through exile without losing grace. Everything they said I was, she once told a friend, was only a reflection of what they feared in themselves. It wasn't arrogance, it was clarity. She had learned that people project their shadows onto others when they can't face their own. So instead of anger, she offered empathy. She no longer chased vindication, she embodied healing. Her laughter returned, softer but stronger. When she appeared in public now, it wasn't as a duchess or an activist, it was simply as Meghan. She didn't need to sparkle to be seen. She glowed quietly from within. Her strength wasn't loud, it was the calm of someone who had already survived the fire and found beauty in the ashes. One evening, as the sun melted into the Pacific, Meghan walked alone along the shore near her home. The sand was cool beneath her feet, the waves whispering secrets of time. She stopped and looked out at the horizon, endless, open, forgiving. So much had been said about her, written about her, misunderstood about her. But in that quiet moment, none of it mattered. She had found wholeness not in returning to who she was, but in embracing all she had become. The Duchess, the actress, the mother, the woman, all pieces of the same heart. She closed her eyes, breathed deeply, and smiled. The world would continue to speak, as it always had. But she no longer needed to answer. Freedom was not the absence of noise, it was the presence of peace. And as the sky turned to gold, Meghan walked forward, barefoot, unburdened, whole.